Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. My name is Franz Stefan Gadi, and I'm a research fellow here at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. We're in the Cyberspace and Future Conflict program, and a big thanks to you all for joining us for this, what I will think will be an interesting and insightful webinar on US cyber coercive campaigns that will hopefully trigger some debate and discussion over the next 90 minutes. I have two great speakers lined up today to talk about cyber coercive campaigns and the use of cyber capabilities to advance national interests of great powers. We have with us my colleague at the Institute for International Strategic Studies, Dr. Greg Austin, who will kick off this webinar with a presentation based on an initial evaluation on the US use of cyber assets and capabilities to advance strategic goals. And then I'm particularly thrilled to have as a second speaker and commentator, Dr. Max Smed. He is a senior researcher at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich, and in my opinion, one of the most innovative emerging thinkers in his field of research. I read a lot of his work over the past 2 years, and in particular, I would like to highlight the volume that he edited and that was published recently on the dynamics on cyber conflict and competition, which was published by the Texas National Security Review. And I really recommend this to all of you if you're interested in the subject. In it, he highlights the need for more interdisciplinary approaches to the study of cyber attacks and cyber competition, something that I also share. And just a few bio details of Max here. He also serves as the director of the European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative. He's also an affiliate at the Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation, and a research associate at the Center for Technology and Global Affairs at the University of Oxford. He's also currently writing a book project that focuses on the causes underlying cyber proliferation and restraint. So Max, welcome, and we are glad to have you with us. And I want to quickly point out that this webinar is really part of a larger research project spearheaded by my colleague Greg on cyber campaigns and coercive diplomacy. And we have two other seminars scheduled, one on China and one on Russia, coming up in the next 2 weeks. You can go to our website or Twitter account to register for these events. The China event will be held next week already on November 27th, and the Russia event will take place on December 3rd. And also, I should point out that we are working on a number of cyber campaign studies actually within our program that should get published in the next couple of weeks. One will be on Iran, another one will be on North Korea, and Greg is focusing on a bigger study that really comprises all the three great cyber powers that I mentioned, China, Russia, and the United States, that is also likely to be published in the coming weeks. So one organizational note, Greg will kick off this webinar, and he will speak for about 30 minutes, followed by Max, and then we will have a Q&A session. And I know that all of you by now are familiar with Zoom webinars, and it would be great if you could raise your hand. I think we have a screen right by our technical support team that shows you how to do this in case you have not participated in a Zoom seminar in the past. Can we have that screen quickly, if possible? Yes, here it is. So I will please raise your hand. I will then activate your microphone and you can ask your question. And my truly last point here is that that we here at the Cyber Space and Future Conflict Program really would appreciate any comments and feedbacks on this session. So please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And we're looking forward to a really interesting 90 minutes with all of you. So over to you, Greg, now.
Well, thank you, Franz, and thank you, colleagues, for joining from different countries. So I will make a short presentation on how I see US cyber coercion. And I've got a presentation here which focuses on the concept of experimentation. And I guess if I wanted everyone to go away with one message tonight, it would be to try and understand better how the process of experimentation figures in the practice of US operations and the development of both cyber capability and cyber operations. So the theme of the presentation is really around the way in which the United States is still really in the phase of experimentation with cyber capability and how we might get to a point where there's more commitment at the level of the political leadership to wider uses of cyber capability and, in a sense, a more heavy doctrinal commitment within the United States Armed Forces as a whole to that transition, to a faster transition in respect of that capability. So the research paper on which this seminar is based tries to address three questions. The first two in some detail, the third one in brief. How has the United States used offensive cyber campaigns successfully for strategic gain? Noting that the evidence is thin and the question is quite complex, the assessment is that the United States has not yet used cyber campaigns for strategic gain. On the second question, how well has the United States organized its assets to use cyber coercion against states? I suggest that it's done better than other countries. The United States is clearly in the lead, both in capability and in operational use. In many respects, perhaps Russia's further ahead in some, but certainly in terms of organization, the United States is better than all other countries, but it still operates under certain organizational reservations and constraints. And then for the third question, what does a 10 to 20 year future hold? The paper conjectures that the full potential of US cyber coercive power is yet to be revealed and that it could be highly destructive and persuasive. So you'll see that there's a common thread running through a couple of those points, and that is that the evidence on which we base these judgments is perhaps not as full as we would like. Let me just dwell on this point about experimentation for a moment. So it might be tempting to see United States cyber capabilities and organizations as in a fairly mature state of development. After all, as different participants in that process point out, the United States has been undertaking these sorts of operations in one way, shape or form for 20 to 30 years. Cyber Command itself has been in existence formally since 2010, although it's clearly been in some developmental work along that pathway. The background to US policy is cyberspace superiority as an objective. And in the 2015 Cyber Command vision statement, the idea that Cyber Command should strive to achieve a situation where cyber options are available in all phases of operations. One topic that's a little bit under-researched in terms of the way Cyber Command has developed is the proposition that it is subject to the normal processes of military analysis, weapons development, and experimentation that's associated with the development of all new weapon systems. Cyber Command is no different from any other US combatant command, which has responsibility in the US system for undertaking that sort of experimentation work. Another aspect that's a little under-researched is the proposition that Cyber Command is one of the few combatant commands in the United States, well, probably the only combatant command, which is responsible for actually developing and building its own weapons. Okay, it might contract out some of that work, but the relationship between Cyber Command itself and its weapons is a much closer one than for any other combatant command. And that has an implication for the testing and evaluation of weapon systems. So for Army, Navy and Air Force acquisition of new weapon systems, they go through a process of testing and evaluation. Colleagues may be interested to look at the 2019 report of the Department of Defense Testing and Evaluation Directorate to see what they say about their newfound interest in cyber weapons. There's a really good RAND report from 2018 which highlights the proposition that not only are doctrinal preferences for cyber operations still being ironed out within the Department of Defense and the US government as a whole, but that the government may be trapped in the early stages of development where there's a degree of what the authors call sprinkleism in terms of degree of commitment to the capability. Another phenomenon that emerges when you look closely at US cyber campaigns is that the interagency process intrudes significantly, especially through the quite significant influence of the intelligence agencies. We might just recall the relationship between NSA and Cyber Command, but I think that the residual influence of CIA and the host of other intelligence organizations in the United States is quite important as well. So the research paper I wrote, and this seminar is really based around 4 case studies. The way they're named is really deliberate. They're named for the strategic goal which the cyber operations are meant to serve, and they're not named for the cyber events which might have been manifest in pursuit of these strategic goals. So the 4 are as named on the screen: hedging against China's rising power, counter-proliferation against North Korea, containment of Iran's legitimacy, and defeat of Islamic State. And those 4 case studies are listed, in my view, in terms of the coercive intent of the United States in those 4 different campaigns. For an ideal effort in case study research for cyberspace operations, there's a number of things which I personally would have liked to have been able to do. And they're listed on the screen there. The first one is to document the strategic goal and to map the diplomatic sentiment before trying to document what actually happened in cyberspace. Now, this is the easiest part of the case study approach that we've pursued here, or that I've pursued. And the aim is to try and understand the decision-making processes, the intent of the strategic leadership, in the United States case, the president, his national security advisors, and the like, about what they're trying to achieve with the countries in question before we try and understand what they're trying to achieve in the particular cyber campaign. And in the 9,000 or so words I've got on the 4 campaign case studies in the back of this paper, there's an overwhelming burden of content on the diplomatic relationships compared with a very small amount of text on what the cyber campaigns actually involved. And of course, I think that bears out, in a sense, the proper relationship between how top-level leadership in the United States, especially the president, in the last couple of decades have viewed the relative importance of cyber operations to US strategic choices. To do a really good job on case studies from this point of view, I think it would be really important to be able to document who gave the orders to launch this coercive cyber activities, and what were those orders like. And in the case of Operation Olympic Games, Stuxnet against Iran, we have a reasonably good picture of how that unfolded, if we can believe the picture given in the book Confront and Conceal. But in almost all other cases, especially for countries like Russia and China, we just don't have the same evidence base. We have a pretty good evidence base for the campaign against Islamic State, although we see less information about the political processes involved in that, while we have a fairly good feel for the interagency processes involved in that. A typical military operation or a campaign would involve leadership review of progress. So it'd be good to know in these case studies who reviewed the progress of the campaigns and what sort of judgments they were making about success, about how the program might be varied, how it might be intensified or scaled back. And we really don't have much evidence for most case studies looked at in this project. Again, for Olympic Games, it's a little bit better. So colleagues, I trust you can see this graphic fairly clearly. It shows a mapping of US diplomatic sentiment for the 4 countries covered by the case studies and a couple of others. And so you can see the legend at the bottom showing Serbia, China, Iran, North Korea, Russia, and ISIS al-Qaeda. And on the left axis, the vertical axis, you can see levels of diplomatic relationship or diplomatic sentiment, starting at the bottom from partner. So the United States views the country indicated as a partner. Going up the ladder on the left, we see competitor, further up, adversary taking little disruptive action, and so on. Now, we might debate where a particular country was in a particular year on this map of diplomatic sentiment, but certainly I believe this is a sort of thing that we have to do to try and assess where these coercive operations by the United States, or potentially coercive operations by the United States, lay in the overall scheme of United States strategy. We see a couple of interesting things. We note that only one country or one target was in actual wartime operations against the United States and vice versa of the cases studied, and that was Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, and earlier Al-Qaeda. You'll notice on the left, top left, a small reference to Serbia or the former Yugoslavia. That's the NATO operations against former Yugoslavia, in which, according to several sources, offensive cyber operations were used against Belgrade. We can debate that perhaps later. I think what's of interest about this particular slide is that the big cloud graphic is supposed to indicate that for almost this entire period, the United States was a pervasive operator in cyberspace. Omnipresent might be too big a word, but in a way that no other country matched for this entire period, the United States was persistent and pervasive before the term persistent engagement really came into mode. We also note that the main cyber coercive campaigns occurred high on the conflict scale against adversaries or an enemy. We also note that they occurred before the Cyber Command and the United States government adopted a policy of defend forward and persistent engagement. Perhaps we could return to those. So the 4 case studies in very brief review. The first one was hedging against China's rise. And we find that for over almost 2 decades, the United States government was involved in support for low-level subversive activities led by the CIA and supported initially by NSA and Cyber Command. Now, the evidence for this is largely circumstantial, but I think that's the sort of judgment we have to make. It would be wrong to assume that the United States was inactive in cyberspace until the recent past. I think that just wouldn't fit with what we know about the country and its intelligence operations. What we see under Obama and Trump is a higher interest in retaliation, a long period of malicious activity by China in cyberspace, and we see references in the public domain to specific retaliation operations by the United States against, for example, the OPM hack or continued IP theft. They emerge under Obama in relatively full force, at least rhetorically, if not in practice, and and certainly were present again under President Trump. And then we have the policy of persistent engagement, which in my view is a relatively low-level policy in terms of coercion. And for each of the campaign studies, I try to summarize what judgment we can make about the particular campaign. And in the case of the US-China situation, I personally judged it to be relatively low level of conflict, well below the threshold of armed force, and with some tactical successes perhaps, but little strategic gain, although the future might hold a different outcome. In the counter-proliferation campaign against Korea, mapping it out against, of course, the broader diplomatic objectives, we do see a higher level of confrontation. We do see a higher level of commitment from the political leadership in the United States to at least pay back North Korea for some of the things it did. We can see active consideration, at least, of attacks on North Korean missiles, so-called left-of-launch attacks, to try and slow down the program and to, in a sense, give the North Korean leadership some pause for thought. Whether or not those attacks actually occurred, as reported in the press, is not proven, I suppose. I personally believe that they're both technically feasible and probably did occur. We've also seen the application of persistent engagement against North Korea, and particularly in the last few years, we've seen a concerted effort from the US agencies to counter the criminality of the North Korean regime. And in terms of summarizing or assessing that US cyber campaign against North Korean proliferation, again, I think we can say essentially a peacetime disposition, wasn't desperately violent, below the threshold of armed force, but sabotage was involved if we believe the stories about left-of-launch attack. We can probably see a few more tactical successes against North Korea and maybe some strategic gain. After all, North Korea appears to have stopped the bulk of its coercive attacks, or its mildly coercive attacks, after 2014, and the possibility exists that the US retaliation against North Korea in cyberspace had some impact on North Korea coming to the negotiating table with Trump, but it's very hard to tell from the evidence. The campaign against Iran's legitimacy and power, a long-standing United States objective over decades. We see that the Operation Olympic Games and the Stuxnet attack emerged when President Bush asked for a less costly option than a major military attack against Iran's nuclear capability. So this is really the future of cyber operations, when the political leadership says, don't tell me how I can bomb it, tell me how I can do it in a non-kinetic fashion. And when George Bush asked that question, he didn't know that cyber was the answer, nor did the people who went away to study it, but they came back with the cyber answer. We should also note that, as in the case of China, that the US agencies led by the CIA were probably involved in an intense and long-lasting campaign of information confrontation against Iran. One of the most interesting developments in all of cyberspace history occurred in 2020 when Donald Trump ordered a cyber attack in retaliation for the Iranian attack on a US drone over the Persian Gulf. And for all of the criticisms one might make of Donald Trump, even up to this very moment, Donald Trump made a principled decision to use a cyber attack in retaliation, citing the very principled proposition that since nobody was killed in the Iranian attack on the US asset, then he would prefer a non-lethal retaliation, which was a cyberspace attack. And that is the future. In much the same way that President Bush, in asking for a non-lethal, a non-kinetic option against Iran, Trump's opting for a non-lethal retaliation against Iran is the future. When the leaders of the country are asking or at least being advised to in this case. I don't think Trump asked for a non-lethal option. He was given the choice. I think this is the future. And so again, in the case of Iran, notwithstanding the high level of conflict and confrontation between Iran and the United States, my assessment is largely a peacetime disposition. Stuxnet was an illegal operation under international law. It was sabotage across international borders, the same thing for which the International Court of Justice found against France for its attack on Rainbow Warrior in a New Zealand port. Use of violence for sabotage across state borders is illegal in international law, and Stuxnet was an illegal attack. This is interesting because what it says about the Iranian campaign is that the United States was prepared to go to a higher level of coercive intent or activity in the case of Iran, because in a sense, the level of antagonism, hostility, and strategic interest that the United States was engaged in was much higher. Whether or not the United States achieved any successes out of its attack on Natanz nuclear enrichment plant, I think there's a lot of different views. I don't really think it achieved too many successes, perhaps some tactical success, maybe some strategic gain, but I think mostly, apart from showing the US intent and capability, largely negative. So, US war against Islamic State, 2 phases. One where the US government wanted to maximize intelligence collection and avoid attacking Islamic State assets in allied countries. So bear in mind that the recruiting and internet-based propaganda of the Islamic State was not being run out of the territory in Iraq and Syria. It was being run out of largely allies of the United States in Europe, such as Belgium and France, and an attack on the cyber systems that were supporting Islamic State recruiting and propaganda would have, by and large, been an attack on allied countries. So that was a pretty big problem. But for the United States agencies, I think maximizing intelligence collection to keep open the option of targeting the leaders of Islamic State was the highest priority. In 2016, they made a different decision, and the public documentation on this campaign against Islamic State after 2016 is quite amazing. Cyber Command itself has released quite a number of documents under freedom of information, highly redacted, of course, but very interesting. And what's notable and important about, of course, the war against Islamic State, that the cyber operations had a wartime intensity that was missing from all of the other 3 case studies. Okay. Yeah, and so clearly some tactical successes in the campaign against Islamic State. Whether or not there was strategic gain, hard to say, I think, even based on what we know. So overall, the perhaps obvious conclusion that I draw from the look at those 4 cases is that cyber coercive campaigns are more likely to be successful in times of war or political crisis, and that if we're really trying to understand cyber coercion, there may not be a lot of value in trying to debate what cyber coercion might look like in times of relative peace. So we can see United Nations economic sanctions or national economic sanctions as a form of coercion in peacetime. They're understood as such in international law, but whether or not we can fully understand offensive cyber operations as coercive activities in peacetime at low levels of hostility is another question. So I'm left with the view, I guess, that retaliation in cyberspace or active defense in cyberspace don't really meet any reasonable definition of coercion. One of the main issues I think is really important for understanding future development of cyber coercion is the role that leadership choices will play. So I've alluded to the George Bush request in 2007 or so for a non-kinetic option or a non-bombing option against the Iranian nuclear facilities, nuclear enrichment facilities. And I've alluded to Trump's decision based on advice to opt for a non-lethal campaign, a non-lethal retaliation for the Iranian attack on the US drone. But as we cast ahead and we want to understand how states regard use of cyber assets for any sort of political purpose, but principally for coercion and for strategic gain, I think we have to understand the degree to which the leaders know about cyber capability, are briefed on it, and are presented active choices. And even once we reach that point, we have to recognise that the leaders will be subject to all sorts of political biases and their own political choices. And even if they accept to use cyber weapons or a cyber coercive campaign, they can decide at any point to modulate their commitment to that, to scale up the cyber operations or scale them down. And it's sort of interesting in cyber case study work so far, we haven't seen a lot of attention paid to the way in which leadership choices by the political leaders that count, i.e. in the US case, the president, how that has impacted on cyber operations. Now that the legal authorities have been passed down the chain a little further after President Trump's decisions in 2018 to do that, the leadership choices arguably become not as influential, but I think that if we're talking about political coercion against a foreign state, the Secretary of State, the President, Secretary of Defense, these people are going to be very prominent in the decision making. And so until those people are well versed in the capabilities of cyber assets and used to using them, I think that we won't see the sort of transition that's been foreshadowed by many people, including in the 2015 Cyber Command Vision Statement, where they talked about cyber operations in all phases. Now I'll press on because I've gone over time here and I'm terribly sorry. So the end point of this research was to say, what about the future? Well, we can look at, as a guide to the future, the sorts of attacks that have been done in the past. We could cobble together a major cyber offensive against any country consisting of events that have already happened of the sort shown on the screen or contemplated. An ultimate cyber coercive campaign for the future is going to be something very different. In terms of where we are in the relative development of cyber weapons and cyber offense, I think if we compare that situation to how military aviation developed in the last 150 years, 120 years or so, I believe that we're really still very much at the experimental phase. So in 1914, Japan used ship-borne seaplanes to launch an attack on Qingdao. There were 4 planes involved. The ship was actually a seaplane tender, but the level of violence that was delivered by military aviation up to that point was relatively modest compared with the full potential that we saw later through the Blitz on London and the Battle of Britain. And I think that the future of cyber coercion is going to be much, much more serious than anything we've seen in the past, and that the full potential of US cyber coercive power is yet to be revealed. It will be highly destructive and highly persuasive. So thanks, colleagues, for your attention. Over to you, Franz and Max. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Greg, for a fascinating presentation, and I think it really leaves us with a lot to think about, and particularly enjoyed that you were highlighting some of the under-researched areas in our field, and the last point also that you made, I think, is really crucial in terms of this idea that leadership choices really matter to shape strategic culture, and then in turn also the culture of services. And I think that goes beyond just cyber capabilities, right? It really shapes also military modernization efforts beyond cyber, as we recently also saw what's been going on in the United Kingdom with modernization efforts there, and the intervention of the British Prime Minister when it comes to modernizing the UK armed forces. And then of course this idea of kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities and leadership choices, non-lethal options and so forth are also extremely important. And I'm glad you actually mentioned that attack also of the Japanese attack in 1914, because it happened to take place against the Austro-Hungarian warship, and of course that navy no longer exists. So in any case, just out of patriotic reasons, I'm glad that you brought that up. And they actually didn't end up sinking the ship, so that's also good news, I guess, for Austro-Hungarian patriots. In any case, let me hand this over now to Max for some comments and also his assessment of this particular subject. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, Franz, and everyone else at IISS for inviting me back. I really appreciate it, and congratulations on a fascinating paper. I think it's an important contribution as it adds to the current debate in more than one way. So first, I think it adds because we still lack very much good case study analysis. And as you say, this 20,000-word paper with a detailed empirical analysis of 4 cases is really important, particularly if you put this in this larger context of the project with also looking at Russia and China. It's also the case, I think, that we still tend to box in cyber very much as something unique happening on its own. And I think this paper is one of the very few fantastic pieces that really puts cyber in a broader context to make sure that we assess the overall political and strategic goals of a state, and through that the success of cyber operations. I couldn't agree more that that's crucially important. And last but not least, know that the literature is still very much stuck in this binary notion of whether cyber coercion works or not. And I think what this paper does so well is to move beyond that and really talk about the conditions for when cyber coercion works or not, and providing a much more nuanced analysis. I have 5 main comments to make, or maybe 6, depending on how much time I have, and I've structured them basically around 5 questions. So the first question is, what is so to say needed for cyber coercion to be effective? And let me start with a small conceptual point. You will not be surprised that I say that I like the term cyber campaigns, and you provide a clear definition of specifically what coercive cyber campaigns means. But know that the concept and definition of coercion differs from certainly the conventional political science and international relations literature. So some may be confused when you use it in the paper. Schelling famously distinguishes between 2 forms of coercion: deterrence and compellence. Deterrence to dissuade an adversary from doing something, and then compellence to make sure that the actor stops an activity undertaken or changes or gets to do something that it has not yet undertaken. And I wonder, and from that specific definition, I wonder if the 4 campaigns you described fit any of that classic notion of coercion. I think you're much more focusing on, instead of changing the cost-benefit analysis of an actor, on basically taking away the capacity to act. So I'm posing perhaps a not very helpful first question here as to whether you simply may want to reconsider the use of concept here to avoid confusion when the report comes out. To the main points, I also remain a little bit unconvinced about the provisional assessment that cyber coercive campaigns are more likely to be successful if undertaken in times of war or political crisis approaching war. There are a lot of factors to consider here, and I think it's worth pointing out some of those as well. Consider the goals alone, right? Like using a cyber campaign to hedge against Chinese cyber power, or the future of China as a state within the international system is much further reaching goal than a counter-proliferation initiative against North Korea, or taking down propaganda material in the case of ISIS and helping the war through that. And I think it's also worth highlighting a bit more evidence from the case study about ISIS to make your claim about effectiveness during the war, right? Like, I am very much reminded of the statement from former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter when he has this Belfer report about particularly the limits of the cyber component there, right? So I quote from it, he states, I was largely disappointed in Cyber Command's effectiveness against ISIS. It never really produced any effective cyber weapons or techniques. When Cybercom did produce something useful, the intelligence community tended to delay or try to prevent its use, claiming cyber operations would hinder intelligence collection. This would be understandable if we had been getting a steady stream of actionable intel, but we weren't. The State Department, for its part, was unable to cut through the thicket of diplomatic issues. And so he felt, you know, particularly Cyber Command, but also the other agencies weren't actually very well capable or adjusted in this cyber fight. And so highlighting some of that and going beyond the slides that are particularly presented by Cyber Command through the National Security Archive is valuable and runs counter to the assessment that cyber campaigns tend to work well in times of armed conflict. The second question is one about what about basically the dogs that didn't bark? So as you say, the case study discussion in this report, I really think that it's both admirable and inspiring. And as every research, we have an inherent tendency to focus on those campaigns which did take place, because of course, those are the ones that we can study. But it's really worth considering, I think, for a minute, those cases of restraint or the dogs that didn't bark, right? Lacking that discussion, we are much more likely to exaggerate the, so to say, trigger happiness of the US government. So where do we expect the US to conduct cyber operations? But we have no evidence that it did. Do these cases exist? Now, one case that I'm thinking of is Iraq. There are some unofficial reports of very minor use, but largely they didn't do so because of one, immature capability, and a clear lack of understanding, particularly on the legal side, around collateral damage, and no clear frameworks in place yet to do so. But I think there are also others. Why did the US not conduct cyber operations against Syria in 2018, combined with the bombing of Damascus and Homs following the chemical attacks? Or I'm thinking of earlier cases against Syria in 2012, where the US sent batteries of Patriot missiles sent to Turkey to prevent any missile strikes from Syria. Could it have been combined with a counter-proliferation campaign similar to the one you described against North Korea? And that reminds me also of the last slide you just presented about this, that we still have to see the full potential of US cyber coercive power that has not been revealed. Fortunately, it didn't take place, but I think at least the academic, but also of course the political study and the general debate we would have would be completely different if NitroZeus would have occurred. So for those who are not familiar with the case, Stuxnet, of course, was already said to be a masterpiece of work, but there was also this option to develop a larger scale preemptive strike from the US that the New York Times reported on, called NitroZeus. And to quote from the New York Times, NitroZeus was part of an effort to assure President Obama had alternatives, short of full-scale war if Iran lashed out at the United States or its allies in the region, through a full plan to take down air defenses, communication systems, power grid, and so on. So again, only if we assess the decision-making on cases of restraint, we may miss out on the role cyber operations play at different points in time, the role of leadership, and so on. Another one I think worth highlighting, because it's an issue close to my heart, is the question as to what the role allies play. So if your case studies have anything to say about it, I would love to see this written. It's really, I think, something that is also under-highlighted, and I think the case study evidence there has something to say about it. And I'm considering three aspects. The first one is is burden sharing possible among allies? It's, I think, an unresolved question, and my sense is that the role of partnerships when it comes to coercive cyber campaigns is rather limited. There could be some coordination, particularly around levels of access, but it's really hard to have the same type of cooperation as found in the conventional domain. And that's one to consider. The second is, to what degree cyber campaigns are not conducted to just coerce adversaries, but also to reassure allies. And I think that's where the Iranian case discussion comes in, with the Stuxnet case here vis-a-vis Israel, right? Which also clearly comes back in the Sanger book. And third, it's about allies almost as the victim of US coercive cyber campaigns. So what is the impact of some of those US operations on allies? And I've written a little bit about this before in Lawfare and other places, that if you consider the ISIS case, we know that the Washington Post reported that cyber command operators wiped ISIS propaganda off a server located in Germany, with the Germans being notified about it in some fashion, but weren't asked for advance consent. So that caused much frustration and certainly had some friction on diplomatic relations. Now, some of those things I think are worth highlighting to show that in many of these interactions and campaigns that the US undertakes, other dynamics are at play simply in relation to the actor it seeks to coerce. The next question, the fourth one, if I'm correct, is what is required to conduct a coercive or cyber campaign, and how will things change in the future? I really like the statement about the required capability to conduct coercive campaigns. And it also reminds me of the first US Cyber Command Symposium, where a person, based on a question from the audience, stood up rather frustrated and drew this large box and said, like, look, this is all the type of activity that can be done in cyberspace. And then drew this tiny box and said, you know, this small box, that's the activity that we are allowed to do. And it kind of, for me, it showcases a broader principle here. And I call it myself the restrictive capacity principle, where causing any type of effect against any computer system or network at an unspecified point in time, lacking a clear strategic purpose, that's really easy or relatively easy. However, causing a specific targeted cyber effect as a designated point in time, which achieves a strategic purpose and outweighs a wide range of negative consequences, that's really hard. And so the rule of thumb is that with each additional operational requirement, it leads to, I think, a disproportionate increase in resources, skills, and time needed to run an operation. And I think an interesting aspect with the US is how it, on the capacity side, has both lowered its restrictions in recent years and also increased its capabilities, allowing for a wider range of activities. Now, of course, still many things haven't been solved on the capacity side, let alone just simply modeling or being aware of what capacity is required, to what degree, if you would have a host of capabilities like implants and ODAs today, whether they're still effective tomorrow, all those questions are unresolved. But I think it helps to explain some changes that we have seen. And that brings me to the next question, which is, how does US Cyber Command's organizational development influence its operational activity and mindset? And in the paper, I really like the discussion about the legal and doctrinal setup in 2012 versus 2018. We no longer have the same White House approval process, which might also change leadership. And the lines are shorter, the ability to act is slightly easier. There are a couple of, I think, other dimensions that are worth highlighting here. So the first is, of course, it was the US Cyber Command was established in 2009. And it was in 2015, 6 years later, that it reached at least half of its target of being fully operational. or fully operational being having 133 mission teams. And then it is said to be officially fully operational in 2018. Now, I think that development really matters in our understanding of some of the campaigns that that are discussed in this paper, right? Like what the US Cyber Command could do pre-2015 or pre-2000 and post 2018 in terms of sheer capacity, even though in many cases we know little about it, I think is crucially important. It can change its goals as a result of it as well. And secondly, US Cyber Command became a unified combatant command in mid-2018, right? Before that, it was subordinated to US Strategic Command. US Strategic Command has as mission to deter, right? And US Cyber Command was very much folded into that logic. Now, the moment it was no longer subordinated to it, it also freed itself from certain organizational shackles, and it could much more easily roll out this strategy of persistent engagement, which moves away from this deterrent logic towards a much more proactive logic as well. And I think that change in US strategy, I think, whilst still many of the facts are not out there, I do think it is one of the most significant changes that we have seen in US thinking, certainly in the past 2 decades, but maybe even earlier, the point that Jay Healy has made as well. It really moves away, I think, from anchoring concepts like deterrence and resilience towards persistent engagement, and it changes not just its actions, but also it perceives like how this field is shaped and what is important to counter. And perhaps, you know, like it's an interesting question whether, for instance, ISIL, the ISIS campaign can be seen as an example of persistent engagement or not, or persistent engagement in the Defend Forward. And I think you can make both arguments, right? Like you can say it was because, you know, it was clearly an operation that sought to disrupt its freedom of action. It sought to be active. It sought to have superiority in this domain to make sure that you can keep the momentum, etc. So from that perspective, it did. However, if you look at the latest DoD strategy, the focus is, of course, like where it in the past mentioned non-state actors, the focus is now on actors that can truly affect the balance of power, right? It focuses on China, Russia, and then secondarily to Iran and North Korea. From that perspective, you know, it's not a campaign that can truly influence US position necessarily in the world. And one may argue, as a result of that, it doesn't fit within that initial description and understanding of Defend Forward and US role in the world. Perhaps ISIS, the campaign, also shows both the limits and opportunities, right? It shows the opportunities of being more active. And yet it also shows the limits, and particularly in the case of ISIS, having a really small attack surface. In the end, we're talking here about mostly disrupting the propaganda machine. And there is not that much more to be gained there, unlike potential activities against states. All right, last comment. This is a broader one, a kind of parting thought. And that is whether we should conceive a cyber conflict as either a game of poker, a game of chess, or a game of Go. And the point I want to make here is, I think we can conceptualize cyber conflict in a wide range of ways. And that leads us to different understanding on the strategic impact of operations, right? So if we believe cyber conflict is very much a game of poker, then it's a competition in risk-taking, right? It's a clashes of power and will. It's like you try to intimidate the adversary, you try to signal, and through that you want to make sure that through coercive concessions, you may even avoid future escalation, right? So some may point out to making sure you're in the adversary networks, letting them know to make sure that you deter them and so on. If you believe it's a game of chess, you would argue that cyber is much more competition in tactical cleverness, right? Dan Altman wrote a great paper on advancing without attacking. And I think cyber could also fit in that, right? Like both sides try to compete intensely and unilaterally sometimes, but really also doing this, apply pressure where they can and making sure they do not quite cross red lines and the use of force, but still improve their strategic gains. There, making sure that you dissuade an adversary from doing something is slightly less important. And the third one, and I think these two both come back in all 4 case studies. The third one, the game of Go, the Chinese game of Go, is slightly different, right? It's an abstract strategy game where you really try to surround in the game more territory than the other. And then this one early move that someone plays, and an early part of the game can really influence the whole board structure later on. So you kind of get this sense of like, okay, much more this notion of cyber campaigns as, in the words of Ben Buchanan, shaping operations. But also you can think about other like activity that is going on that is crucially important. Like take the crypto AG case, would be critical case for understanding the role of cyber campaigns and to what degree they can create strategic advantages. And so the three cases, I'm not want to say that one exists, the other one doesn't, but the highlighting the differences in strategic advantages through these cases is, I think, crucially is valuable. These are my short or my long comments. Thanks again for letting me join in.
Well, thank you very much, Max. Fascinating comments, and again, lots to think about here. And perhaps the answer is that depending on the circumstances and what adversary you're facing, maybe all of this is really a combination of all 3 games, depending on various factors here. And I particularly also enjoyed your specific comments on the campaigns that were analyzed by Greg here, and this idea that what about the dogs that didn't bark? I think that's a consistent problem also with researchers in the field of cyber in general. And again, also, I think it was really important that you highlighted the role of allies here and this idea whether they're actually capable of burden sharing. I think in the United States case, this is a particularly interesting question within the context of the 5 Eyes, and then also this idea of assuring allies through cyber operations. And of course, the larger point also that is sort of underwriting all of this is this idea that maybe we just have to get rid of this concept when it comes to cyber operations to a certain degree of war and peace. And this idea of consistent or persistent engagement is fairly consistent also with what is outlined in the National Defense Strategy in the United States, right? This idea of great power competition, it's also found in the National Security Strategy and so forth. And I think there's a synergy in all of this here. So in any case, thank you very much for your comments. And now let me please open up the floor to questions. As you all know, just raise your hands and I can unmute your phone. I'm just going to collect a couple of questions and then let Greg and Max answer, and maybe we'll kick it off with Greg first. So please go ahead. Let me see. There's one hand that already. Two. Okay, if for some reason I can't, why can't I unmute your microphone?
Hi friends, this is Tom in tech support. If you want to direct me to who you want, and I'll unmute.
Well, if yeah, my apologies. I just see that 2 attendees have raised their hands, and I can't click. Can you see it?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll
Yes. Okay, so we have Yogendra Kumar, please.
Thank you. My question basically, in fact, there are 2 or rather 3 questions. One is when we talk about cyber weapon capability, what kind of an array of weapon system you actually have that you can marshal, which actually has the visible effect of deterring an adversary? I mean, particularly if the adversary, let us say, is a great power. That's my first point. And whether from that one can draw some kind of a, think in terms of a wargaming scenario, let's say, between two adversaries as far as war being played in the cyber weapons domain. So, and the third point actually I want to make is that, it was mentioned that in the case of Iran, it was actually a low grade kind of a cyber activity. But I'm just wondering why. I mean, what was the reason why it wasn't escalated to a level that Iran would realize and recognize that its aggressive activities on the ground, whether it's in Iraq or elsewhere, they can be effectively deterred by the full marshalling of the cyber, offensive capability of the US. Thank you.
Okay, can we go to Frank Hoffman now? Yes. Hi, Frank.
How you doing, Franz? Thank you. I missed the early part because I was transitioning from teaching today. So I'm afraid I missed the first few minutes of the speaker. I'm fascinated with the topic and I'm very optimistic about cyber capability, but the historian in me wants to support the previous questioner and ask for, my understanding of past historical cases in the interwar period. We made the same claims that we're now making about cyber with respect to what strategic bombing was going to do. And that apparently, misread the nature of societies like the Brits in the Blitz or the Germans in the strategic bombing of the CBO. I think we misread what strategic bombing would do in Korea. We misread what strategic bombing could do in Vietnam. At least in the American side, we have this fascination that there are some technological solutions that are going to have effects on decision makers and populations and, our capacity of striking at nodal infrastructure pieces, which was the essence of the American theorists in the 1930s, which has been just, hardly supported by kinetic operations in the last three wars. So just like the previous questioner, I'm looking for, some more evidence, maybe some more cases, an understanding and appreciation for strategic cultures, and then the action reaction competition that went on with strategic bombing. We just didn't anticipate German fighter production, anti-aircraft. We didn't anticipate weather issues. There's just historically a lot of factors that need to be wrapped into this, and I think our speakers today can talk about things about the nature of societies today that offset or displace those previous history studies, and I want to give them a chance to swing at those. Thank you.
Okay, let's have one more question, and I'll let Greg and Max respond. Emmanuel. Emanuele, the floor is yours. Okay, I see that you also, oh, please go ahead. I think you have to unmute your microphone.
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Can we define, to Mr. Austin, can we define cyber coercion below armed force threshold part of a strategy of attrition? This is my first question. The second, which is related, is really cyber offensive power, stronger than cyber defense? This is a very well-known question. And the third is Mr. Austin's assessment of the effectiveness of Stuxnet in achieving its strategic goal, which was of slowing down, disrupting the Iranian nuclear program. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Emanuele. Greg, do you want to kick off the first round here?
Thanks, Franz, and thank you, Max, for your detailed and insightful comments on the presentation. I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. but there's quite a few questions here. Perhaps I won't get to them all, and Max, maybe you could pick up a couple. I'd like to comment on the what cyber weapon deters, the question from Yugendra. This is why the subject, or your question points to one reason why the subject of cyber campaigns is pretty important, especially in the context of the overall cyber posture of a government. So in a sense, for a cyber campaign to deter, I guess the receiving state would want to be confident that the target, the attacking state or potential attacking state would have the will and the capability to follow up. And that sort of idea of follow-on cyber campaigns, we really haven't seen evidenced yet, I wouldn't think, in full. One might say, given what Max said about this operation, which was planned but never took place against Iran, that there's certainly the will on the part of the United States and the capability. But I think that understanding the deterrence posture of a state depends on really a combination of overall national capability and will and demonstrated posture in cyberspace. So it's not so much a cyber weapon as the availability of cyber attack vectors across multiple fronts and a demonstrated will to use them. We could go into that in further detail. The question on why the US has showed restraint in cyber operations against Iran. Max, perhaps I could turn you to that when I'm finished, since you talked about restraint. On the strategic bombing campaign, the analogy is quite interesting because the boosters of cyber power, cyber military power, really do suggest that it can have strategic effects in the same way that the early theorists of strategic bombing thought that strategic bombing might have effects. But so I think the analogy is quite interesting and quite useful. And the fact that all sorts of realities emerge to constrain the effectiveness of strategic bombing in that way is a very good reminder that similar sorts of obstacles or realities will emerge to constrain the effectiveness of cyberspace operations. But I'm reminded by a statement of, by the question to recall a statement by the commander of the United States Indo-Pacific Command. I think Admiral Alexander made the statement that in a speech in 2020, where he was talking about US-China relations and basically saying that the United States wanted peace with China and peaceful cooperation, good relations. But in the event that China chose differently, he basically said that the United States would use network warfare to paralyze Chinese command and control in a way that made its capabilities irrelevant. So he was more or less expressing the same sort of visionary, expansionist vision of cyber capabilities having a strategic effect in a way that perhaps the theorists of air power and strategic bombing did in the earlier period. Emanuele's point about cyber coercion and attrition, I think, is a quite interesting one, but it, in a sense, follows, it's related to the question of restraint and the absence of follow-on campaigns, if you like. So bearing in mind that Stuxnet occurred in, before the year 2010, effectively, or running into 2010 a bit, the fact that there's been no major reported US offensive cyber campaign against Iran in the same way suggests that attrition is not really happening, although there are press reports of stepped up cyber operations against Iran since 2018, Iranian press reports, some US press reports. So the follow-on is definitely happening against Iran. I think we're forced back on an assessment of even if there is attrition, and I don't think there is much attrition, it's not having the strategic impact that the United States would want. Max, perhaps you might like to comment on the question of offensive power versus defensive power.
I actually have like two other small points to make. The first one, just to stress, I think now, particularly today for US, deterrence is one of the many goals, right? But actually they've increasingly moved away from this notion that they can dissuade, particularly Russia and China, from operating in this space. And so the belief is very much, if we can't dissuade them anymore because of the opportunities to act in this space, we need to take away their capability. We need to minimize their room of maneuver, and we need to constantly engage with them. So it's this initial focus on deterrence and dissuading an adversary from conducting any operations has moved much more towards making sure that they can't operate anymore. In relation to Stuxnet, there may have been some deterrence goal. I think there was a wider range of goals there as well, and it's worth keeping in mind. Of course, as I mentioned before, maybe presenting to Israel a more elegant solution to instead of bombing, but also maybe even, although that will never, like Sanger briefly mentions it, maybe even a certain element of humiliation. And this sounds strange. What I mean to say here is, if you're able to get to someone's most secretive asset that is so deep down underground, and you show that you're still able to affect it, what doesn't that say of you as power? And if you can't even protect your crown jewels, what does it say about you? I think there is an element there which the special forces literature writes about in terms of potentially taking someone's, literally their jewels, their crown jewels during a war. Maybe there is some element there in cyber operations as well to show that elegance without even the Iranians realizing, with like firing many of their nuclear engineers because they have no clue about the program. And of course, after that, not willing to say that this attack happened at all. There is, I think, this element there, a psychological element that is worth keeping in mind. The third brief point is on, I think Francis Hoffman's point on action reaction and strategic bombing, I think is a crucial one. The fascinating thing here is, of course, we actually know of very little US activity and Western activity more generally. There is a bias in reporting where we tend to underreport on Western cyber activity. And so that raises a really interesting question as to how do we know, in the case of US-Iran, whether Iran strikes first and it's an act of aggression, or whether they simply retaliate? For an expert to really lay that out is incredibly difficult. And I think we've made mistakes in the past. Like, we now know through the Snowden leaks that the US used a certain wiper, wiped a lot of data off a servers or computer networks of an Iranian oil company. And it happened before Shamoon, which Shamoon is the case of Iran attacking Saudi Aramco in Saudi Arabia. Just from that classified information that has been released, we certainly see the Iranian operation in a very different context. And I think some of that, there is a danger for all of us to basically not see much of our own activity. And as a result of that, too quickly draw conclusions on the incentives of other states to strike back. I realized I then haven't answered the question on offense, defense. And I think that's a tough one. I briefly mentioned in the presentation this restrictive capacity principle. And the point here is then, it's not whether offense dominates or defense dominates. It's inevitably actor dependent here. More, I think, even than any other space, right? Like, it's actor dependent in that if you are a NATO ally who is true, or like NATO actor who is truly afraid of collateral damage, you're gonna do so much testing and retesting. You're gonna really, at least you would hope, make sure that you can avoid collateral damage. You're much less likely to conduct certain type of operations. You want to do this at a specific point in time. You want to have a strategic goal. However, if you're an actor who doesn't care too much about collateral damage, you can kind of see how it runs in the wild, like we have seen with both WannaCry and NotPetya. your ability to operate much more quickly with way less resources changes completely. And so this actor dynamic on how different actors are constrained, I think, is crucially important.
Thank you, Max. Do we have any other questions? Let me check.
Perhaps, Franz, I could just add a small footnote to one of the questions was around US restraint in cyberspace against Iran, and Max alluded to it in passing. In the Sanger book, there's a rather interesting reporting. There's rather interesting reporting on how several officials viewed the Stuxnet attack as an experiment. So they don't use the word experiment, but Sanger reports that most officials did not have high confidence that the attack would work. So maybe it's selective reporting. But one of the officials that he quotes in the book uses the phrase, well, we thought throwing some sand in the gears might be worth a shot, or words to that effect. So I think the experimental aspect of this use of cyber operations and mini cyber campaigns at this stage of development of the capability is quite important. Perhaps it's not so much a question of restraint as a question of leadership preferences. So we know that the decision to use Stuxnet arose from this request from President Bush for a non-kinetic option. We know that President Obama reviewed the whole program early in his administration, and he in fact authorized the biggest destruction of centrifuges at Natanz. But this question of leadership choice is pretty fundamental to how we go forward. It really is the case that there are very few leaders of anywhere in the world who are saying to their military commanders, let's develop our cyber capabilities in a way that can give us non-lethal options to achieve strategic outcomes. There's almost no leaders asking for that. In fact, there are leaders in many countries who are, in a sense, pushing back the advocates of cyber power and submerging them in institutional debates and institutional constraints. And so it's possible for every country in the world to identify the people in the chain of command who are the champions of cyber capability and those who are not. For example, in the case of Australia, we know that there's nobody in the highest levels of government who's got any intuitive feel for cyberspace and modern technology. So how does the Australian Defence Force push forward a cyber developmental agenda for military operations where cyber components have a much bigger place? And it's the same in the top level leadership of the Australian Defence Force, although that picture has changed over a number of years. And so you can look at the Chinese leadership and who runs the strategic support force and see what their background is. Are they airborne soldiers or are they former cyber warriors? And it's a very different profile from what we see in Cyber Command. So the leadership choice, the leadership development has to go a long way in most countries before we arrive at a point where the full coercive potential of cyberspace operations can even be actualized in government policy and in government preferences. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Greg. I see you have one more question. Yogendra, your turn.
Oh, thank you. My point really was to what extent the cyber weapon systems actually work as a deterrent. And deterrence effect only is achieved if it can be demonstrated. For everybody, so that they know that if the adversary wants to do something harmful to you, then they know that they'll have a far higher price to pay. And here the example which was given about the commander-in-chief of the Indo-Pacific Command that who said that he can paralyze the entire chain of command in a network-centric warfare. Perhaps it might be better in terms of the deterrence effect to demonstrate it rather than to say it. So that's basically how I'm getting at this entire discussion, which is very fascinating indeed. Absolutely superb. Thank you.
Thanks, Yogendra. Just a quick comment from my part. Max might like to come in. I think the way in which the United States has demonstrated its cyber military capability towards China is probably unrevealed in the public domain. I think they've revealed enough of it to impress upon the Chinese leadership the perception that China is relatively backward in its military cyber capability and that the US has high potential for military operations in cyberspace in a way that the Chinese forces would find humiliating in any sort of conflict. I guess that's one advantage of the massive Chinese cyber espionage, is they know how good the US capabilities really are. So I don't know what you would think, Yogendra. Do you think that the Chinese leaders have high respect for US cyber military capability? Have they demonstrated, in a sense, enough capability and intent to the Chinese to achieve some sort of deterrent effect? What do you think, Yogendra? Probably muted still. Anyway, Max, did you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, I mean, there is the famous phrase, right, that you can't parade computer code on the streets of Moscow or Pyongyang, and I think that's very true. The argument I'm making in my book, though, is that because of that, because indeed it's difficult to showcase that, what we see is a signaling through institutional capacity and building, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why we see many countries being particularly so vocal on the establishment of a cyber command, where literally in for instance, the Dutch case, the Queen can come and can show all the flashy monitors and say, hey, this is what we're doing. Now, the second point, I think, is also what Greg refers to, is this, even though you can't showcase your capability, there is a certain reputational aspect. Through early regulations, it leads to an ability to more credibly convey that you are able to conduct some activity. And the paradox, I think, there in the US case has come from both the Snowden leaks as well as other leaks, where on the one hand, it was one of the most humiliating experiences for particularly the US intelligence community. And yet, the Snowden leaks, and Martin Levicki has made this excellent point too, they also showed a certain capability of what the US was capable for, right? And so in the future, when the US does make an argument like, hey, be careful because we will otherwise do X, Y, Z, in a way, strangely, because of also the leaks, it might be more credible.
Thank you, Max and Greg. I think we have almost run out of time now. If there are no more questions, then perhaps I'm going to wrap up this short webinar here. And let me first and foremost thank both you and Greg on a really excellent and illuminating discussion. I think we all took away a lot from it, and I personally did, and it definitely raised some questions in my head as well. And for me, it also highlighted again this the emphasis on leadership really matters in all of this, and now in this debate, and in particular how it influences also strategic culture and service culture and so forth. Since Frank brought up strategic bombing in the interwar years, I was thinking about the 1942 Doolittle raid, when the United States tried to demonstrate that it actually is capable of hitting Tokyo, and it served really no particular military purpose per se, but it definitely had a huge psychological impact on the war and on Japanese leadership to a certain degree. And I do think that there are some parallels that one can draw here, and also to underline that there's certain elements that one can find when it comes to US strategic culture that are fairly permanent and have been well established over the decades. And I don't think cyber is going to alter these sorts of strategic cultural elements in US strategic thinking. In any case, thank you very much again to the two of you, and thank you also to the audience for sticking with us for 90 minutes. Let me just once more remind you that this is really just the first part of the three-part seminar series. We're going to have our next seminar on China on November 27th. And again, you can register on our website, or also find links to that event on social media. And then we're going to have another seminar on Russia on December 3rd. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and have a wonderful day, evening, and night, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.